Look, we've got a really interesting presentation talk today. Almost all of you know Andy. I had a 2-page bio on Andy. I was going to read it. I'm not going to waste my time. Award-winning journalist, created New York Times in 2007, the .Earth blog. He's blogging now, as you can see.
Actually, yeah.
I'm sure you are. I'm sure you are.
On this.
And you know, he's somebody that 20 years ago began writing about climate when nobody was worrying about the climate. He was writing about 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and then 5 years ago, people said, "Oh, we must have problems with the climate," you know. And so his colleagues began writing about it. So he's way out in front, and we couldn't be more excited about him being here. He's sitting next to, and we'll be going back and forth with, Dr. Brad Allenby. Brad's a faculty member in the Fulton School of Engineering. He's particularly in the School of the Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment. He's also a Lincoln Professor of Engineering and Ethics, has an appointment in the School of Law also. And he, if many of you who know Brad, he's done a lot of work, almost considered one of the grandfathers of industrial ecology, spent time as Director of Energy and Environment at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, was at AT&T running their energy, their environment and safety program at AT&T before coming here. And he is provocative, to say the least. And so looking forward to what's going to go on. I also would like to introduce, just for a quick second, the Honorable Christina Johnson, who's sitting in the front row. Christina is the most recently Undersecretary of Energy and is here visiting ASU with her science advisor, Mark Hanchey, and we're glad to have her in the audience also. Thank you, Christina. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Rob to start the festivities.
Let me just say a word about how we're going to conduct today's session. It's going to be a little different than some of the sessions we've had in the past that you may have attended, the Wrigley Lecture Series, and it's going to be a conversation. And so after some fairly brief opening remarks by Brad and Andy respectively, and some kind of responses to one another, we're going to try to keep that fairly short. We really want to engage in a dialogue here. And so my job really is to try to bring questions from you into the discussion. I have plenty of questions for them that I've got in my mind I'd love to hear, but I really want to hear from you. So we'll have a microphone going around, and hopefully we'll be, Mindy will be fleet of foot in doing that. Try to keep your questions, I only ask this, try to keep your questions short and get to the question. Okay, get to the question. We have the opportunity to listen to two people who are world-class thinkers on the subject. And so please avoid the editorials, okay? And try to get to the question part of it so we can hear from them and get some discussion going. And that would be, I think, the most profitable way to spend this time. So with that, Brad, I'm going to ask you to speak first and to make whatever comments you feel are appropriate for today, considering we're only talking about the future of the entire human civilization and the planet in which we live.
Thank you, Rob. First, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. And Andy, I'd like to thank you for slogging out from JFK. Appreciate it. What I'd like to do is I'd like to start with a couple of videos which I think answer the question really as well as anything I could say. So if we could roll the George Washington piece.
Here's a couple of things America got right. Cars and freedom.
And now, for our second learned study, could you roll 1984?
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory reports. Our unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
So a couple of thoughts about those advertisements. The first is, if you don't understand why they were up there, then you probably don't understand the world that we're already in. Now you realize, of course, both of those were the same ad. And if you think about it, what they did was take a technology which for many people is iconic for personal freedom and associated it directly with that. Both of them were heavily understated. The Dodge ad didn't even mention Dodge, and yet both of them are very potent. I showed my engineering class the Dodge advertisement, and they realized it was totally hokey. They realized that it was completely phony, that it was designed to manipulate them, and they loved it. When I was in the Army, going through basic training, and most of the folks with me were going to Vietnam, the pinups were about half and half. Half of the pinups were what you'd expect from hormonally challenged males, and the other half were automobiles. Chevys, Fords. If you don't understand the appeal of those technologies, if you don't understand how integrated the human and the technological spheres already are, then you don't understand the world that we're trying to deal with. And the simplistic solutions that we derive absent that kind of knowledge are going to fail. So I want to suggest a couple of things. The first thing I want to suggest is that what these advertisements indicate is that we're facing a world that is far more complex than we think it is, because the objective pieces that we can get a hold of, the data, the climate change, the artifacts, those are all embedded in culture and psychology. Every problem we deal with is a wicked problem. It involves humans, it involves irrational aspects of our behavior. And unless we know that, unless we're prepared for that, then the solutions we suggest are going to fail. I don't want to start off by being provocative, but let me point out that we have been negotiating climate change for 20 years. Over that period, emissions have gone up every year. That is hardly an encouraging track record. Our idea now is maybe we'll do geoengineering, take massively powerful technologies and unleash them without much of any idea of what's going to happen. This does not speak well of what purports to be a sentient species. But I want to make some other suggestions too. Look back at those ads. One ad is for automobile technology. One ad is for information and communication technology. Both of them speak to the allure of technology in supporting personal freedom. I'm not going to talk about Egypt or Tunisia or any of that. I don't have to. What I want to do is suggest something much more basic. If we really want to manage technology, we need to understand how to manage the relationship that people have with different types of technologies. Is it possible, for example, that I can take the network generation and shift them over to perceiving ICT as iconic for personal freedom rather than automobiles? And if I can do that, will it make it easier to change underlying automotive technology in ways that may be more desirable? That's the kind of thinking I suggest we need to be concerned with. I'll conclude by thinking of something that happened to me very recently. I was reviewing an article for the best environmental science and engineering journal in the country, ES&T, published by the American Chemical Society. It was a life cycle study of biofuels. It admitted that there were a number of difficult issues, but it was a life cycle study of biofuels. This life cycle study ignored completely the fact that if you accelerate the flow of carbon through biological systems, you necessarily accelerate the flow of all the other elements that are part of those systems. Nitrogen, phosphorus. We're having a meeting on phosphorus here at ASU tomorrow. But most people don't know that the phosphorus cycle is fairly heavily impacted by human activity already. Nitrogen, of course, is badly impacted by human activity. So what are we really doing with biofuels? Something that this LCA missed completely. What we're really doing is we're saying we're going to fix the carbon cycle by breaking the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycle. Again, I suggest to you that if we purport to be a sentient species, we've got to begin doing better than that. So I guess I would leave it at that. Andy?
Well, boy, that's a good place to start. Not to leave. If we could go to my laptop here, I'm just going to show a couple of images as conversation provokers as well. And I'm thrilled to be here with Brad, who I had never met face to face, but for years now I've been drawing on his brain. Until today, actually, in my mental map, he just was a brain. Like this, like in that Harry Potter scene.
And you're saying that's gone downhill fast.
No, I feel much better now, actually. Like the Harry Potter movie, the brains floating in those aquaria. And I love the way you think. And this isn't a debate, really. This is, I think we're on similar tracks. I've come at the issues of our time in the role of communicator. I never even played a scientist on TV. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an engineer. I've spent close to 30 years talking to hundreds of scientists and engineers and looking at issues that matter, like climate change, the role of agrochemicals. One of the first stories I did in the early 80s was about, on the environment, was about a pesticide called paraquat. That was a great new tool in this kind of agriculture called no-till agriculture, which has all kinds of benefits, but there were side effects. Paraquat was poisoning thousands of people a year in developing countries who drank it accidentally. It's a brown liquid. They would store it in Coke bottles, and that's a bad combination. So I've been going at it, though, from those standpoints, and with climate change, which I've been writing about since the mid-1980s, I spent the first 15 years exploring climate as a biogeophysical problem. Emissions are rising. These are the possible consequences. These are the possible secondary consequences for nature and for things that matter, like water supplies. And it was only the last 5 or 10 years I really started to home in on an element I hadn't really considered, which was the element I've been using personally to explore all these questions, which is my mind, the human mind. And on my blog, the reason I started .earth more than 3 years ago was after several decades of conventional journalism, of talking to people, trying to get a sense of, okay, this is what we know, put that in a paper or a magazine or in a documentary a couple of times. I was always searching for definitiveness, and with journalism, generally, there's sort of a faux sense often of definitiveness, of clarity. The New York Times front page is black and white. But actually, when you stand back from it, it's really gray, if you can't see the individual letters. And I began to realize, again, the last few years, that if I'm not examining, not just being a journalist, if I'm not looking at the whole pipeline, how information matters or doesn't matter, how people absorb knowledge or reject it based on predispositions, that I'm not really going to get traction. And that means I've dived into this very ugly arena of cultural cognition. There's a website I encourage you to write down, culturalcognition.net, one phrase, which is a place where researchers led by Dan Kahane at Yale are exploring these boxes that we're in, durable silos, really, where if you're in one, you're going to go out there and reject anything that sounds like global warming from human activities is a dangerous thing. And if you're in the other, at the other end of the spectrum, you're going to actively embrace anything about the weather that seems to fit in a marginal way that we're heading into a catastrophe, and you're going to reject anything that gets at the durable uncertainties about climate. And so that's what led me also to shift from conventional journalism to a new role where I'm still writing for the New York Times in an interrogatory way every day. I'm not telling you, most of the time on .earth, I'm not saying what I think. I'm asking questions, like I did yesterday about Egypt's uprising, and I mused on, I said basically, this is a great moment to examine some of these issues. Look through the last few days or week of speculation on what triggered the uprising in Egypt, and you can find essentially everyone with an agenda found a lesson in the Egypt uprising. It was about poverty, it was about a dictatorship, it was about global warming, if you're climate progress. It was about food insecurity. And I said, I raised the point that it's probably at least partially about technology, about the fact that if you want to collaborate and coordinate massive demonstrations today through texting and cell phones, you have this incredible real-time ability to sort of get a lot of people to do something at the same time or to think about something. I want to show you very quickly a couple images. One thing that we need at this time is new ways of thinking about information. You can't see this very well, but if you go on the blog, it's been there a few times. There's a British illustrator named Adam Nieman, N-I-E-M-A-N, created these portrayals of Earth's liquid and atmospheric resources, where he took the actual known volume of the world's oceans and fresh waters and made it into a sphere. And so that little green bubble on the left there is all of the world's liquid water. And I've sailed across 2 oceans when I was younger, so I know how big the oceans are, and it's amazing to be in the middle of the Indian Ocean, 1,000 miles from land, with 2 miles deep of water underneath you, and it feels utterly beyond measurement. But then when you actually put it into a ball, it's really small. So I think that's an interesting way to captivate it and galvanize a discussion of anything related to water resources. You look at that. By the way, you can't even see the fresh water. If you put the fresh water into a sphere at that scale, you wouldn't see it. The one on the right, the pink bubble, is all the atmosphere. If at sea level pressure, if you took all the air in the atmosphere, put it in a volume at sea level pressure, that's the global commons. That's what we have to parse out to 9 billion people in a few decades in terms of who has the right to pollute or not pollute, and especially with greenhouse gases, that's a big issue. So there's a new way of thinking and having discourse about climate, energy, water resources that comes from a new way of measuring and conveying knowledge, which is a great thing. And these images will be so dark that I won't even go there. This picture says something that I think you can see. This is three pie charts. You can see the dark area, which is red. This is who has cell phones in the world. And at the left, it's 2,000. The overall dimensions of the pie are the total number of cell phones. It was 700 million cell phones in 2000. 2 billion in 2005. And as you can see, by 2005, it's essentially roughly 50-50, rich countries and poor countries. Now it's 3/4 of the world's 5 billion cell phones are in developing countries. 3/4 of the world's cell phones, 5 billion cell phones, and we'll be up to having more cell phones than there are people in a few years, are in developing countries. To me, that says very powerfully that discourse is the opportunity for both learning and shaping knowledge and spreading ideas is explosively growing. That means we're at a great moment in our history. We have this. There's been this talk of noosphere. This is the idea of the planet of the mind for generations. There was a French theologian and a Russian geochemist in the 30s who came up with this idea of information will be this sort of global resource a long time ago. And now we're kind of inching toward having that potential. But as Brad said, we also have to look inward and see, it's not just about sharing information, it's about self-recognition. How do we, facing complicated problems, like how to minimize conflict on a crowding planet, how to minimize risks of contributing to long-lasting global warming and sea level rise. Those, if we don't look inward and recognize how we as human beings, for the moment, have limited capacity to deal with some kinds of problems with the wicked and even super wicked qualities that Brad alluded to, we're not going to get there from here. And one thing I love about Brad's title here is it's engineering and ethics, which means you can't really move forward with one or the other in this century. I wrote on my blog today that each of those things alone is insufficient. If we all take on the attributes of the Dalai Lama, and who's an omnivore, by the way, he's not a vegetarian, and the attributes of Lester Brown, and we're still 9 billion people seeking decent lives, you can't get there from here without technology. But technology alone is insufficient as well, without some new sense of values on how to share those bubbles that I showed you a few minutes ago. So that's a good place to stop and now start to ponder some things.
Okay, let's have just a brief reaction, Brad, perhaps to Andy's remarks, and then vice versa for just a moment, and then we'll start with some questions. Okay?
No, I think Andy got it right, as he usually does. The part that's interesting is if you look at some of the figures Andy was showing, what we are not doing well is understanding how rapidly change is undermining virtually all of our operating assumptions. I mean, you assume that China is behind the United States in terms of educational quality. That's not the case. Leading areas of China like Shanghai are in fact well ahead of what we do in the United States in terms of educational quality, according to the latest international surveys. We assume that people in developing countries don't have access to the same kinds of information flows that we do. Certainly not in the same way, but that cell phone indicator shows that they've got plenty of access and they know how to use it. So I think that Andy's points are very well taken. It gets even worse because, of course, one of the differences between past periods of radical change, and we've had them, the railroad was one such, one of the differences is that in this period of change, we are far more than before able to make the human part of the design space. So if you think about the world of the past, it was humans changing the world for their benefit. Now, you have a situation where that arrow goes both ways. Humans may be changing the world, but we can also start to redesign ourselves in deliberate ways. The question that has already arisen, and which I leave you with, is there anything about the human that is not contingent? Anything at all? Because if you think there is, you'd better start paying attention now, because it's being undermined. We're developing drugs that can change your memory. We're developing tools that will, taken all together, enable possibly radical life extension. People who are working on this at Harvard and Stanford talk about the individual that's going to live to 150 with a high quality of life already having been born in this country. What does that do to virtually every assumption we make about sustainability? If we start to have a population of rich, wealthy people with money to spend and consumption that they want to do, that lives to 150. Who gives? Do we live to 150 at the expense of people in other countries that are already dying at 45 on average? What kind of equity are you going to have in a world like that? Andy.
Well, there too you get, I still feel overall optimistic about this, despite all of these foreboding questions. And one reason I think I feel that way is that the gap between, there's still a glaring gap between the absolute richest and the absolute poorest. But because in part of things like that cell phone graph, we're poised right now to have information and knowledge and insights matter in ways, in places that couldn't reach that information in a faster way than was ever possible. I've already got in my head a map charted out from, I don't know if anyone saw the story in the New York Times in December, a great piece about a woman in Kenya in a rural village who was tired of going into town and getting overcharged to charge her cell phone battery periodically at a ridiculous rate. So she invested $50 in a solar panel for her roof and put it up and started charging her cell phone at home. She had a light that her kids could do their homework by, and their grades were going up. She then opened up a little business in her home charging other people's cell phones because she had a surplus of energy. And now her neighbors are putting her out of business because they're buying rooftop solar panels. Now, these solar panels are completely uneconomic at the scale like to power Phoenix. Again, or you'd have them. But in a special situation like that, there's an outsized value. Even that small, costly amount of energy is transforming life in that village at a runaway pace. It's infectious. And so that says to me, okay, you've got a kid with a cell phone and a light to study by, an LED bulb. In rural Kenya, you have open university kinds of portals now so that anyone virtually with access to the web can study at MIT or Arizona State. So you have this potential right now poised, and the academic community can be a very powerful, we were talking about this at breakfast, can be a very powerful engine in facilitating the globalization of having access to the kinds of information that foster innovation and prosperity. Now, that won't happen on its own. Well, it is happening on its own in that little village, but I think it can be greatly ramified and amplified by things that we can all do right now. So I'm kind of like, I'm okay with where we're at, even though there's a very daunting sense of the future right now.
I'm going to start the questions, and then I want you to be thinking of your own questions, and I'll call upon you. And Mindy, you're going to be running around the microphone, right? First, a very quick one, because Andy just actually answered the question I had for himself already, which was, on a scale between optimism and pessimism as we ramp up to 2045, where do you stand? You said you were an optimist. Maybe in between we have guarded optimist and guarded pessimist. Brad, where do you stand? Are you optimistic about our future, or do you think we're in trouble beyond repair now?
I guess I would say I don't think that that's really a valid question.
Thank you, Brad. Where was that in the script? That
I knew
Brad
you'd like that.
embarrasses executive dean. Yes.
No, in the sense that I think both optimism and pessimism imply a level of knowledge about the future which I am completely incapable of. Right. I do think that the world that we're facing is awesome in the original sense of that word. It has the potential for extraordinary events. The generation of students that sit in front of me now in class are going to see things that no generation of human history has ever seen and that we have only dreamed about in science fiction. It's going to be extraordinary, but it's going to be very, very dangerous. High risk, high reward, a very, very challenging and interesting world. Optimistic or pessimistic, I'm just in awe.
Yeah.
I want to ask one question for both of them, and then I'll open it up. You actually touched on this, Andy, a moment ago, and that is, we think a lot here about how you get the information, knowledge, scholarship exported from the university. How do you get it applied? Many of the people in this room, faculty, students alike, and many of our colleagues across campus deal with aspects of sustainability on a daily basis in teaching, research, and things like that. But with the possible exception of the formal technology transfer system that universities have, universities are not particularly good at presenting their knowledge, presenting their information, communicating, as you were talking about last night, Andy, to the decision makers. So how do you export this rich understanding and knowledge and discovery of technologies, but not just technologies, but the social dynamics and things like that that are not widgets and cars or computers, to the decision makers who actually have to apply these things to solve the problem of sustainability? How do we get over that bridge? How do we get from here to there? Because my experience, at least, is that decision makers, whether they're city or state or they're private or public, look to universities for these solutions. but often we're not forthcoming with them in a way that they can understand or use them. So how do, in your opinion, what are some good ways perhaps that we as university, members of university and a knowledge community, can we export some of this knowledge so that it gets applied to problem solving?
It's a wonderful question. It presumes that decision makers matter. And I do think they matter in some ways because they apportion resources. The federal research and the federal R&D budget. Actually, can I quickly show a slide that's relevant? While I'm pulling up the slide, I'll say that there's evidence. I think the thing that the Academy can do best is to make the case that information and that science particularly and that inquiry matter. And that part of what has to be conveyed is that failure matters. Because we've kind of like, if you leave it up to the conventional politics to determine how to apportion a finite R&D budget, for example, you'll always do it based on things other than that reality, that if you really want to advance society, you have to let a lot of things bloom and fail to have some not fail. Just to give you a rough sense of where we're at with energy inquiry in this country, and this chart, you don't need to see the details. Basically, Sputnik is at the left, and the end of the stimulus package is at the right. This is a graph of 50 years of scientific inquiry as funded basic R&D money from the federal government. And the private sector money is different. It's had a downward trend overall. What you see in yellow is the space race. So back in the, Sputnik went beep, 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 and we really had a moment, as we were saying this morning, because it was truly an existential kind of moment. So we cared a lot, and we had several tens of billions of dollars a year of expenditure on R&D related to space. That all kind of faded away. The upper band, the dark purple, is health, medical research, not building hospitals, but studying cancer. And there's a lot of questions about whether that was effective. A lot of it failed. And maybe that was all misappropriated, but it was misappropriated because it shows we care about health, so we spend a lot of our R&D money on health. Energy is the green band in the middle that you can sort of see, and it looks like a python that swallowed a tennis ball sometime in the 1970s. And the tennis ball, of course, was the energy crisis. So we went from it being a tiny portion of our R&D budget to it being a slightly less tiny portion. And then it fades away, and it's a bipartisan slumber party, as I described it on the blog, on energy ever since. So I think the scientific and academic community focused on these issues can make a pretty compelling case that, hey, society, if you care about energy, setting aside the climate question, that's how much we're interested in energy right now. It's not a hard point, not a hard thing to make. Now, one last related image is, this is the entire R&D budget of the country. All of that stuff fits in the red at the top there. The rest is military R&D. We spend about $80 billion a year on military research and development now. And I don't think this means we need to rob the Pentagon of some of that. I think the Pentagon already is shifting toward understanding that its R&D should be focused on some of the same issues that we're talking about here. So I think shifting priorities is important, not necessarily taking things away entirely. But that graph is like, for me, it's kind of like in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the movie where everyone's kind of keeps building the same shape. I keep showing this over and over and over again.
Well, Brad, while you formulate your answer, I wanted to publicly thank Andy for not saying that, over there in your chair in the back, for not saying I asked a dumb, irrelevant, and unviable question, as someone else did. But you go right ahead, Brad.
So I think Andy's first statement is important. Do decision makers matter? More subtly, how do they matter? How many degrees of freedom do they really have to make decisions that impact the way these systems flow? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's a lot less than we usually think it is. On the role of academia, I think that the usual position that most academics take in a discussion like this is that if only the public and decision makers were smart enough to listen to us, we would provide that utopia for which they yearn. In fact, I think that and I should point out that this is my opinion only and not that of Arizona State University, I think that academia is badly broken. I think that we have too many people that are living too far in the past, teaching too much information that's already migrated to the net and is commonly available. I think that the challenge that academia faces is trying to learn how to teach wisdom in a world that's gone from information scarcity to information overload, as I think Andy has shown very well. And I think, frankly, we do a pretty bad job of it. And part of the reason we do a bad job of it is that there are very few people in academia that are willing to admit how badly we're performing right now. So I guess that's my response.
Fair enough. Let me open this for questions, and I want to once again appeal to you to ask a question. Okay, yes, sir. Is the microphone coming over? Here, do you have it? Use this. We got a second mic.
So you started out by speaking about the ethics-technology nexus and how ethics is really necessary. And the way you framed it was anthropocentric, or the discussion has been anthropocentric. And I just was wondering why that was framed that way. When we talk about biocentrism, ecocentrism, why the anthropocentric framework?
This is a great and important point. I started to explore this question about 2 years ago when I interviewed Ed Wilson. Again, I've talked to him for a very long time about biology and the broader conservation ethic and his concept of biophilia. And I think the reason we're focused on the human element within all of that is because what we need is what I recently called on the blog anthropophilia. We have been for too long looking at the biological system as something out there, and we usually look at us with kind of a shame on you or woe is me kind of approach to the human element in that picture, rather than looking at us more dispassionately and regarding ourselves, embracing our nature essentially as part of this larger system. And when we say anthropophilia, meaning, anthropophilia to me is kind of the idea of looking at ourselves as part of this larger system and really integrating that, concretizing that reality. But that comes with being aware of us, how we work and how we fail and how our brains work and how we tend to end up in compartments in society. And we have our politics that won't get this right. And we have our traditions that lock us into approaches to knowledge that in some way we recognize aren't working. But how do we kind of break through those barriers? I think that's why we've been both focused on the human element. Again, I think the capacity to innovate is there. The capacity to modulate our behaviors has to incorporate the natural. The reality, as I said with Wilson, he spoke of Wilson's law. I wrote a piece. It's easy to find. Just Google for Wilson's law, and you'll find it. That if we just focus on those kind of the geophysical system and carbon, and we kind of engineer a solution, and disregard the natural elements, will fail. If we focus on sustaining a thriving system, a biological system with us in it, most likely we'll get the geophysical things more right and still preserve the integrity of the planetary systems. So that's kind of, I think that's, for me, that's why we're focusing on the human element. I don't know what Brad thinks.
So I guess the reason that the initial focus is on the human element is primarily, I think, because the human element is, at this point, impacting and shaping many of the natural systems. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, biodiversity, etc. To focus on the human element, for me, does not imply that there is necessarily something better or good about that as opposed to ecocentrism or biocentrism. It's simply recognizing that right now the human element is having an impact across all of these systems. Raising one level above that, what I would say is any ethical system that enables me to view the world in a coherent manner is necessarily partial. And so what I would say as an overall positioning statement is that whether you choose a particular form of human ethics, pick your poison, deontological or utilitarian, whatever you want, whether you choose ecocentrism, Leopold's what is good for the ecosystem is good, you know. Choose whichever one you want, the precautionary principle. They all have some element of validity to them, but they're all partial. And if you're really going to work with a complex system, you need to be able to integrate across different and even mutually exclusive ethical systems. That's a skill we're not good at because we equate that with relativism, which I don't think it is, and we can go into that in some detail if you want later. But my point would be that I think any particular ethical system is necessarily too limited to fully explain the world that we're already in, including the anthropocentric ethical system.
Next question.
So with regard to the anthropophilia, right, you have the human species and the human individual, you know, so
Right.
kind of you could refer to one or the other. And so I think I read somewhere that some people attribute the Renaissance to the impact on the European human species of the Black Death. And
Can everybody hear?
so,
Yeah.
so with regard to, what's an ethical response to kind of the climate debate? Should we seek to postpone the catastrophe, in which case it will be really big, or should we seek to cause it to happen sooner, so that it will be easier to manage?
This has come up many times in my conversations with people on these issues. Dan Schrag, who is now on PCAST, the president's Technology and Science Committee, and who's at Harvard. I guess I'd call him a polymath now on these issues. He's focused a lot on energy as well as on his climate history stuff. Years ago, I had a conversation with him which got to this question of, there's two options facing climate to push the change you would need in emissions as we head toward 9 billion people seeking decent lives. One is to magically build public will to have a higher cost on carbon emissions, sufficient to drive everyone to change their habits and investments and technologies. The other is to push really hard on the technology. And those are two variables, and the pace with which we address carbon would be determined by the two. He's looking at that, and it's really pretty clear we're not going to do it with public will, especially when you realize that nearly all of the emissions that are coming, the new emissions, are coming in China and India, and they want energy. They're very happy for us to pay for getting the carbon out. And then you say, well, okay, we'll just innovate our way. He knows we're kind of not capable of that as well, and so what he says is the scientific and academic and intellectual community needs to have the plasticity to develop the toolkit and the intellectual capacity, what Bill Gates calls the communal IQ, kind of like, so that you're ready, so that you've got the capacity to ramp up in ways that can get at the problem as public will perhaps changes because of some of the clarity that would emerge amid all the frozen fountains in Phoenix, that this really is an issue. And I think he's got some, that's got some merits.
So, playing off what Andy said, I think that what I would argue is that the constraints on climate change are very clear and very powerful, and most of what we propose to do essentially ignores the existing constraints. I mean, the Kyoto Protocol has not worked for 20 years. Geoengineering, even if we're stupid enough to implement it at scale, is not going to work the way we think it is. No powerful technology is only going to operate on one small part of the Earth system. It just doesn't happen that way. That doesn't mean that we're hopeless, though. To use an example out of industry, when the Montreal Protocol was being discussed, the electronics industry in the United States was faced with having to get out of using CFCs at a fairly rapid time pace. We did so, and we did so because we had a lot of options on the shelf, a lot of technology options, some management options, some product redesign options, but there was a lot there. Wasn't used, wasn't commercialized, but it was available. So we got out pretty quickly. Then, because this is the way the Senate works, the Senate decided we ought to get out of lead in 2 years in solder. Couldn't do it. Didn't have the options. We had no technology that would substitute for lead-based solder in electronics. Certainly not at scale. Now, what that tells me is that if we really are serious about being ethical about climate change, I don't think you're going to stop the Kyoto process, so you might as well continue it. It's locked in right now. I think you want to do what you can to avoid geoengineering, certainly at scale. But you can certainly develop a lot of options that would give you the ability to adjust in ways that may have a portfolio of impacts that is manageable. And we don't do that. Let me give you an example of one sample technology, meat in factories. For those of you that like the Dalai Lama, are omnivores, cows are a really, really ineffectual way of making steak. I mean, they are just not what an engineer would come up with. Cow produces 50 kilograms of methane a year. Cows are just really, really inefficient. So you make the meat in factories. Now, think about what that would do. That would mean that the land that we are now using for cattle, for pigs, for chicken, something like a third of the grain production in the world goes to produce meat. That would be freed up. That would give you an enormous area of land to be able to begin to do, for example, biofuels without doing serious damage to some of these other cycles. So factory-produced meat might be a really neat geoengineering technology. Now, some of you here probably run cattle, and your immediate response is, what the flip? It's actually not that, but this is being recorded. So the answer that this gives is a more realistic answer. Nothing we do is going to be without cost. So the question becomes how to balance the costs and benefits in an option space with a portfolio approach. I think gives you the best opportunity to do it pragmatically. But we don't do that, particularly in climate, because the discussion's too polarized right now.
I want to ask a follow-up question about Kyoto, since you brought it up. One of our previous Wrigley speakers, some of you may have been here for Cynthia Rosenzweig, who works with NASA and also with the City of New York, came here and gave her reflection on her time in Copenhagen during the talks, which were by any measure a disaster. And she said that what was hopeful, though, was the fact that while the Kyoto talks were going on and Obama was there and other people were trying to make headway and didn't, that the mayor of Copenhagen convened a group of mayors, and that they made a great deal of progress, and that the report that subsequently came out from the mayor's conference that was going on at the same time as the Copenhagen Conference Among Nations was Cities Act while Nations Talk. Now, since Copenhagen, there has been Cancun, and I see Dan Bodansky, professor of law and also a faculty member of the School of Sustainability, was there, and some progress perhaps was made there, but certainly was not the end-all, be-all. My question is this. Brad, you said we should continue the Kyoto, from that platform, we should continue the talks because even though they failed, and we continue to do them. Would it maybe be more sensible to say, look, nations are not going to agree on this stuff. China and India are just not going to give in, and we should work at a sub-national level to start thinking about how to put together a global patchwork or quilt, if you will, to solve this problem, perhaps at a city level, especially since the world is urbanizing so much.
So, I'm not sure that any kind of approach that depends on a political imposition of meaningful climate change controls is ever going to work. I think that, not directly. I think that the Kyoto Protocol is going to continue, not because I think it's a good idea, but because it's locked in. There's too many institutions and too many people that have devoted too much effort to Kyoto and that process. It's simply not going to stop. Directly, it won't produce anything. I mean, directly, I think climate change negotiations are fairly ineffectual. Indirectly, what it does is it maintains the visibility of the issue, which ripples it across complex systems in ways that we really don't perceive yet. Andy was one of the exceptions, but after Copenhagen, there were a slew of headlines about how the world had failed and climate change controls had failed, which was ridiculous. Copenhagen had failed, and most people knew it was going to. What had not failed was you didn't change the way that different people adapt. I defy you to pick up Time or Newsweek. Is Newsweek still published?
Online, I think, yeah.
Online? Yeah, okay.
I'm not sure.
Or The Economist, and not read an article about climate change. Companies talk about it. NGOs work on it. The public cares about it. Some pro, some anti, but at least they care. So what you have done is you have developed a potential in the system for adaptation that is occurring at levels that we don't think about explicitly. I think we're doing a fairly effectual job systemically of adaptation. I think that we perceive very little of that.
On that, I've been writing about the climate diplomacy since before it existed. Unfortunately, I can say unfortunately, I was at the first meeting in Toronto in 1988 on the Conference on the Changing Atmosphere that kind of led to preceded the Framework Convention, and then have been following it ever since. And I don't, as you say, I don't throw it out. I don't think we need to throw out the whole thing. The Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was negotiated in '92, enshrines some basic fundamental pledges that the emitting countries owe some obligation to assist poor, unempowered countries to deal with what will be their challenge first, which is adapting to coastal change and to climate change. And that's what you're going to see. The one thing that's going to remain concrete in these meetings is who pays how much to who in terms of compensating for the impacts of climate change. The thing that the meeting is useless at is the whole issue that in the late 20th century, the presumption was that the climate problem was a pollution problem. And we were kind of successful with the Clean Air Act. We were successful with CFCs, as you heard. So we just apply that new model to CO2 and we'll just restrict it and have a market and all will be well. It's clear now, what's been very slow for the community to agree is that model does not apply to the energy system. In fact, there was a young journalist, I was in Cancun, and a guy named Alex Kirby was there on a fellowship, and he said, one night we were having a beer in this ridiculous hotel, and he said, turned to me, he was like 23, he was new to this whole subject, and he said, so wait a minute, so they're trying to engineer the economy to engineer the climate? And he went, oh my God, that's so ridiculous. And I said, you know, you're right. Actually, I quoted him later on .earth because he really crystallized that old model doesn't apply. There's too many reasons why it doesn't apply. Going forward, what I've been pitching is the idea, and this, I'm not, the only person saying this, that having a climate, considering issues like development assistance, technology partnerships with climate as one of the filters, just as we do for socially responsible investing. You have climate responsible investing. That making it an obligation if the World Bank is going to invest in a bridge or a dam in the Congo, it better well be resilient enough as a project to considering what could come with climate change. And so it'll be something that's reflected in many different realms of how people and countries interact. But the idea that we'll have a climate-centric agreement that will be the thing that will be the changer of the energy system, I think, has gone away, and it's a healthy thing.
Next question. Yes. We have a mic. Could we get a mic? Okay, fair enough.
Human species has done a wonderful job of setting aside evolutionary forces and manipulating them for our own benefit for the past 12,000 years, very extensively in the last 100. But don't you think, in the end, the forces of evolution will save not Earth, in spite of what we may do? In other words, there's a self-correcting
Yeah.
that's already inherent in the way we were created and the way we evolved as biological entities as well as the physical Earth and all of its attributes.
I suspect people could not hear fully in back.
Maybe you can repeat that.
Can you repeat a little bit of the
Andy,
question?
you want to go ahead? Or?
Well, I've addressed this question recently, and the way I put it is, can we prove that we are something other than bacteria on a plate of agar? You know, so far, I don't think we've really shown that we have the capacity in a big way, at least with energy and possibly with some of the other basic elements like phosphorus, shown the ability to use this intelligence we've got to modulate our behaviors in anticipation of these big risks. We don't yet, science has kind of delineated that for us there is an edge to the petri dish. That's kind of what has happened these last 25 years or 30 years or so on things like climate and phosphorus and nitrogen. But we so far seem to still be just like bacteria on a plate of agar. And it will sure. So the way I framed it in a post I was just looking for is, can we kind of seek peak us before we hit peak everything? Right now, peak everything, you know, you hear whatever, pick your resource. And I think it's still an open question. Can we manage a kind of a soft landing, or are we stuck with letting natural selection kind of do it? And that debate goes on. I don't know, actually we were talking about this too. I can't remember how you consider that question.
Well, I think first there's the obvious point that if you hit the edge of the petri dish, you fall off the edge. But the real question is, are there ways in which we adjust that are not picked up in, say, the biological models by, say, technological evolution? Clearly, the number of people living on the planet right now would be impossible to maintain at anywhere near the current level of population with a hunter-gatherer technology set. You probably couldn't do it with an agricultural technology set. You need the technology sets that we've got now. Do they have other impacts? Absolutely they do. But figuring out how those play out is a lot trickier than it really sounds. There tend to be two kinds of Kool-Aid involved in this particular discussion. One kind of Kool-Aid says there are limits to everything and we're just consuming too much, therefore we're all going to die. And the other Kool-Aid says it doesn't matter, economics always works, substitution works, we're all not only we're going to live, but we're going to live wonderful lives. I think both of those are statements of faith rather than defensible in terms of the data and the history that we're aware of. I think the reality is technology changes, we change, resource use changes as part of those patterns. Right now our challenge is to try to understand these integrated natural human built systems in better ways so that we know what's actually going on. But I think right now we don't. I think this is another area where scholarship is pretty pitiful.
And by the way, just quickly, this is an arena, again, I think, where the way we communicate, the way we convene, the way we teach, to get an accurate understanding, looking behind those kind of headlines or summaries, has to really evolve. And one reason I migrated from the old model of journalism, and I still do it once in a while, I do plan on trying to write a book again someday, to this discourse that's on .earth, is I'm trying to find a way to foster in people an awareness of the complexity that is hidden when you have a public discourse that's mostly undertaken from the edges. In fact, I did a post recently on, I kind of was bemoaning that Obama didn't mention climate change in his State of the Union address, but not for the conventional reason, which is, just to kind of fight the fight against those other guys. I think he could have articulated that climate matters. What you've heard a lot of is very loud proclamations of definitiveness from many people over many years. There is stuff that's really robustly understood that is hidden by that kind of ping pong match that's our public discourse. So let's all as a community go forward and address what we know and what we don't know, to embrace the reality that there's many aspects of the system we don't know, like the fact that there's a fountain frozen near my hotel here this morning, even as we're warming the world. But he can't do that. And I said, I know you can't do that in the State of the Union address, but you better do it in a speech sometime this year. Otherwise, we'll just be locked in this kind of And that's just a microcosm of this broader opportunity, I think, that the Academy has as well to build, and I see it as implicitly being buildable online, a new way of engaging on these fundamental questions of sustainability. How many people is too many? Rather than doing the traditional debate, do a non-debate. What do we agree on? Not fighting the fight to see who wins or loses the argument based on logic, which again, in the midst of real uncertainty, you can't really win. I think there are ways to do that.
Good morning. I had a question. You know, we talk about stakeholders and decision makers that affect the planet. And we talk about governments, and we talk about academia, and we talk about corporations to some extent as well. And so my question is related to what role should corporations have? Because as you, in noticing the first, commercials that you put up there and trying to create desires within each of us, what role do corporations need to play in the fight for sustainability? And given the significant changes in the geopolitical landscape over the last 10 years and what's going to be forthcoming, what risks are there and them being in the game at all as they work in a more global way?
I think corporations, it would do them well to recognize the importance of having a fostering education. I don't mean that in a simple way that universities should have a blank checks written by more and more companies, but I do think that they can help build the case that we don't have the intellectual capital, the intellectual infrastructure that we need to have a smooth ride as a country or a world in the next few decades, and that's something that's important and that they should be a part of fostering. Whether that takes the shape of what IBM is doing with its Smarter Planet initiative or what many other companies like it are doing is another question. I think one thing that has to kind of be examined in the policy arena is the power of companies in Washington to torque how things get done. And that I don't think is going to change ever. Capitalism is fundamentally rapacious, and when the boards of companies are talking about their fiduciary responsibility, I would love to think that they could redefine fiduciary responsibility to have a broader, literally have a broader definition, so it's not just about making more money. And that won't change until the populace more generally has a broader sense of obligations and the ethical imperatives that come with where we're at as a species. So I don't think corporations are going to change. I do think they need to recognize intellectual infrastructure is not there and help make the case that can be built out more.
Yeah, actually, Andy's absolutely right. I would love to see corporations be a lot pushier about the failings of academia. It's very, very hard to get academics, particularly tenured academics, to understand how badly they're performing. And if corporations could help a glimmer of light enter into that medieval mindset, they would validate their existence. That said, I think, with all due apologies to my colleagues, that said, I think corporations have an interesting relationship with society at this point. The idea that corporations should be responsible for sustainability is an attractive one because they're so powerful and because they control much technology. The danger of it is that corporations, once they become responsible for sustainability, are not very good at it. I mean, if a corporation is bad at doing economics, they find out. That's what Chapter 11 is for. But if a corporation is bad at doing sustainability, then that's a much more difficult kind of challenge to hold them to. Having been on the corporate side, there's an additional challenge that comes up. It sounds as if corporations should be able to respond to sustainability. The problem is, everybody's got a different idea of sustainability. When I was at AT&T, we were dealing with a German rating organization for sustainability purposes, And we were doing great until they found out that we provided service to the American military. And then they rated us as a don't buy because we were assisting the American military. Now, not only did this ignore sort of views which might have taken a different perspective, but it made it very difficult to follow this line, and this line. There's the idea that everybody agrees with what sustainability is. That's a very useful fiction. It helps us all get along. We don't scream at each other, but the fact is, we don't. And as a corporation, when you're getting hit with questions about, do you do this, do you do that, do you do this, it's very hard to know whose agenda you should privilege. And particularly if you're a big corporation, because if you privilege somebody's agenda, you're swinging a lot of weight. Is that your role in society? Should you really, for example, swing a lot of weight towards an anti-military campaign by a German NGO? Is that your job as an American corporation? So it's not as easy as it sounds superficially.
You know, the idea that Walmart, by fostering better practices in its supply chains, is going to have the world of 9 billion people living decent lives by doing that is kind of a fantasy. Walmart is selling consumption far more than it's selling LED light bulbs. And I think that the idea that the corporate world will be the thing that changes this, I think, is kind of fantasy. But I'm not anti-corporate, because that overall, Matt Ridley has written a book called The Rational Optimist that I encourage you to read, whether you agree with it or not, because it builds the case that commerce, essentially, global commerce, the history of commerce, interchange, exchange, trade is the main thing that has caused the human species to have its innovative capacity multiplied far beyond anything we know of in nature. And so that trade being commerce in business, is something that's fundamentally important.
There was a question over here.
The London Geological Society, I think in the last few decades has talked about the Anthropocene era from sort of a biocentric and ecocentric perspective, how human culture is reorganizing the geological systems. Now, I wonder what you would all think about, it seems what we're speculating about is a geological transition toward, the way I would like to see it is in the, say, 100 years in the future, the London Geological Society will look back and consider this period a transition from the lesser Anthropocene to the greater Anthropocene. And so I wonder what the role of the university and maybe emergent businesses in your minds and things like that are in a larger project of a epochal geological transition.
I'm taking notes because I'm going to tweet that later. That's great. In 1992, I wrote a book on global warming that came out in 1992. And I wish I knew Greek better back then, because I posited that we were, at that time, I wrote that we were entering the Anthropocene instead of Anthropocene. And so I could have beaten Paul Crutzen, a Nobel Prize-winning chemist, to the punch on using that phrase to describe.
Isn't that a type of coal?
Huh? It is, actually, but again, you know, I wish I had known my Greek roots of words better. That's a great, I like the idea of just delineating two phases of the human era of planetary domination. I think in a way, yeah, and again, as the other question, what I wrote, again, gets back to this idea of whether it'll be a conscious thing or whether it'll just be there because we kind of hit the wall, and then you'll see this trace of our decarbonization being enforced on us because we lose the capacity to burn coal and we become a much tinier species. So that still is the question. Will that be a conscious transition or one that's enforced upon us by the systems? That's the question to me.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. I use the Anthropocene all the time when I write because it's such a convenient way to express the state that we're at now, where humans really do impact, if not dominate, many elements of natural systems. Maybe not in terms of overall volume, but certainly in terms of critical dynamics. But here's the question I have about that term. The Anthropocene is used as if this were the human era. Now, if you look at geologic time, humans haven't been around long enough to be a human era, much less the Anthropocene, the last, 20 years? So it's not clear to me whether the right model is that we're the human era or the right model is that we're the human meteor at the KT boundary. I just don't know which one it is. That said, either we're going to hit the wall or it's going to become a much, much more human world. This question came up earlier with elements of nature. There's a lot of nature, quote unquote, that's out there, but it tends to be preserved because we've designed it into our institutions and our systems. The Florida Everglades is what it is and will be what it will be because we decide to do it so that it becomes a part of a human system. It may have a lot of nature in it. It's far more complicated than we understand, but it is preserved to the extent it is as part of a deliberate design choice that we make. That's a very different kind of world than any that we have known up until now. And it puts a lot more responsibility, ethical, moral, and rational, on us.
In tweetable terms, it seems like what you're saying is as long as we focus on education and on research, we're going to figure it out whether we, come up with solutions that are going to prevent the problem, or when the problem comes to us, we're going to have options for people. So, but then I hear that education's broken, and then I hear this, and then they kind of get you more and more scared about the things that are fundamentally broken. And so, what are the things we can do to make sure that we're educating people right? How is that part going to change? Are we going to take away tenure? Is that going to solve the problem? What kinds of things can we do?
So start.
Yeah. Well, we were talking about this at breakfast a little bit too. Why don't you dive in a little bit on your model? You had a...
All right, yeah, so think about education the way it is now. And okay, again, I am not speaking for ASU. Think about education the way it is now. It's a batch processing model, right? We take in students, they sit in front of us for X weeks, we certify them and we ship them off to the next manufacturing station. It couldn't be more manufacturing. Now the problem is that as cognitive systems change, and that's what social network is doing, that's what Google is doing, as students change cognitively, what you end up doing is you end up with a longer and longer stretch between the leading edge and the trailing edge. We get people at ASU that haven't had a lot of experience with computers, and we get people at ASU that are digital natives, that have grown up and live with and in social networks. And those are very different people. They have very different educational needs. Now, the way we teach them is we bring them in and we do batch. That's not good enough anymore. What we need to do is develop serious personalized education that relies much more on hyper-volume spaces that students go through at their own pace, that have enough AI in them to be able to know when students have matched performance requirements of that particular module. And you say, whoa, that doesn't work. Sure it does. World of Warcraft does it all the time. How do you get to a new level? Don't give me this, it doesn't work. It doesn't work for academics because we're very poor at thinking about anything but the way that we taught people in the 1950s. So I think we can do better.
And of course I moved out of journalism to academia to become effective. So, and I'm not on a tenure track, so I feel good about that. I do think there is huge potential in new ways. I have a feeling they'll shove aside the old way of doing things, whether it wants that or not, because again, building that case again, kid in rural Kenya, cell phone, in 3 or 4 years that'll be a smartphone, access to the web, watching a lecture by Brad Allenby from rural Kenya, and that kid can be like a guy named Alex Eze, who I met at a population conference a year ago at Berkeley, he lived in Zambia. He was a kid growing up in a village where several of his brothers and sisters had died already. His father was freaking out, sent him to live in a town with his uncle. He went to school, he went to college, he got a PhD, and now he's the leading African analyst on population and development trends in Africa. I think there's a huge potential now to take, for that achingly lacking part of the humanity, I'm sure a billion or so people who are willing to educate themselves, who have the capacity to become innovative and part of the global intellectual infrastructure, and to get them at least some of what we have here in spades that we just take for granted. And so again, I think there are models that's going to happen. I'm going to try to make it happen myself, and I know others who are interested in it as well. So I think the model will then swamp everything else. One last thing though, we were talking about the other things that's at risk here is what we're transitioning from, as Brad was telling me this morning and earlier, the era of information scarcity where you owned it and you sold it. That's going away in the face of an information abundance where I think, how do you have a business model to maintain either a school or a newspaper in a world that looks like that is a challenge. That's a different question.
Yep.
We have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask the last question. Brad, how do you really feel about how academia is doing? You don't have to hold back. It's okay. You're among friends here.
Well, people who were friends.
Yes, right. Seriously, we have about 2 minutes for each response here. A lot of the people in this room and a lot of the people in the ASU community, if you will, are studying sustainability in one form or another. What advice would you like to give the students, whether undergraduates or graduates, in this room and beyond, about the one experience that they really should have if they want to go out in the world when they get their degrees, whatever they may be, and have a positive impact on the future of this planet? What is something they must do or learn, in your opinion?
You want to go first? Or you want me?
I
think
go
he asked
Andy,
you
while
first. Yeah, so you want the bumper sticker, right? Don't drink the Kool-Aid. Seriously. Everybody is going to try to give you something that is going to guide your belief system, that will tell you what to think, whether it's a capitalist or an environmentalist or a Democrat, Republican, Tea Party. Everybody's got Kool-Aid to sell. The problem is that in a sufficiently complex world, if an issue is simple enough to be dealt with through Kool-Aid, it's simple enough that it doesn't matter. All of the stuff we've talked about, education reform, climate change, biodiversity, evolution of technology and humanity, none of this stuff lends itself to Kool-Aid. The problem is everybody, including your professors, wants you to drink the Kool-Aid. Don't drink the Kool-Aid.
And actually what I would do is build on that and say, don't get paralyzed by argument, by the fact that we don't know, and by the fact that you're faced with a confusion of too much information and polarization. I think that the great opportunity now is to reclaim constructive discourse and not blaming the edges, but embracing the richness of the human community, which will always have edges, and where, unfortunately, passionate people at edges of arguments always dominate discussions. Have you ever been in a party or any other venue where that's the case? I think when you self-recognition, and when I mean self, I mean recognition of Homo sapiens' shape, is something that lets you look at all that paralysis and still wake up in the morning and say, let's get busy. So that I think is a prime, to have that reflective moment. Oh my God, here it goes again. But not to be paralyzed by it. And to realize we live right now at this unbelievable point of opportunity. It's like asymmetric warfare. I mean, the same thing that tragically Al-Qaeda proved is capable, is potential, the potential is there in constructive arenas as well. To create models, to demonstrate success at an unconventional means, and to become the next Wikipedia, which would be a pretty powerful thing. I still can't believe Wikipedia only is like 30 employees.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So anyway, that shows you again, it doesn't take an IBM or an AT&T to do this.
On behalf of ASU and the Global Institute of Sustainability, I want to thank you for listening in and participating in the conversation between Andy and Brad, and please join me in thanking both of them today.